Hey everybody, this PowerPoint is going to continue the discussion of the American Revolution by focusing on key concept 3.1 and the foundations of and the actual American Revolution itself. So getting started, the last PowerPoint discussed the beginnings of the First Continental Congress, and if you remember, that Continental Congress was formed in response to the Intolerable Acts. The main purpose, though, was to really, have the British government, address their grievances, and the Declaration and Resolves uh, was sent to the British Parliament and was ignored by the British Parliament. Additionally, the most significant action of the Congress was the Association, and this called for a complete boycott of all British goods, non-import, non-export, and non-consumption. Yet keep in mind that First Continental Congress, there was no real desire to be independent. They merely wanted their grievances addressed. And like I said, once again, the King and Parliament did not respond to it because it would have recognized Congress's right as a legislative body. Okay. After this, though, the British are going to send continue to send troops into Massachusetts, and Parliament orders the new appointed governor of Massachusetts to arrest leaders of the rebellion and prepare for military action. And in April 1775, what we call that shot heard around the world, British redcoats sent secretly to nearby Lexington and Concord to seize weapons arsenal and to arrest Sam Adams and other revolutionary leaders. This was the famous ride of Paul Revere, the British are coming. And, ultimately, the Battle of Lexington and Concord began when Minutemen refused to disperse and shots were fired. 8 Americans were killed, 10 wounded, and the Redcoats went on from Lexington into Concord. And, at Concord, the British are basically forced to retreat by American reinforcements. And by day's end, there were 273 British casualties and 95 American casualties. Minutemen camped outside the city and were getting ready for Boston. And so thus this shot heard around the world begins this war. And one of the most direct impacts of this shot heard around the world was the formation of the Second Continental Congress. And so the Second Continental Congress now is now meeting with all 13 colonies to address the issues that had occurred as a result of Lexington and Concord. Beginning in May of 1775, delegates were still not interested in independence, but wanted to address their grievances. But they did, and the most significant act of this Second Continental Congress was that they decided to go to war. They elected George Washington head of the Continental Army. This was a very political appointment, although many historians agree he wound up being a pretty fantastic leader. Not all, though. But moving on, Northerners, the Bostonians in particular, wanted to bring Virginia into the war as well. Also, like I said, with this, Jefferson and I believe it was Dickinson drafted another set of appeals to the king and the British people. And this, declaration of the cause and necessity of taking up arms, was, seen as an intermediate step towards a Declaration of Independence. Once again, there was no desire to actually be independent, but they did set a plan to raise money and create an army and navy. They also sent out a last-ditch effort to avoid war, and largely written by John Dickinson was the Olive Branch Petition, which, once again, this conservative Congress pledged loyalty to the Crown. They wanted to restore peace and appealed to George III to convince Parliament to reconsider the Intolerable Acts. Once again, the King and Parliament refused to recognize the Congress. The war rages on, and some of the early battles are fought, of course, and so forth. What we're going to also see during this time are colonial calls for resistance, and some of the philosophical reasons that's going to go behind this wall. And number one, the colonists very strongly believed in their rights as Britishmen. The Enlightenment had begun in France based on British ideals, and British subjects based on going back to the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights in the 17th century, were guaranteed certain rights, and they felt that these rights were not being met. Furthermore, keep in mind, once again, the colonists had believed in the system of self-rule. And from, the founding of Jamestown in 1607 through the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, the colonists had been able to pretty much rule themselves without much interference from the empire. And this continued to draw people to the patriot cause. And once again, those Enlightenment ideals of liberty, Enlightenment ideals of a social contract. In fact, John Locke's idea of a social contract: if a government does not rule in the interest of the people, then the people have the right to revolt. Rousseau also had that similar idea with the social contract. And it were these Enlightenment ideas of liberty, these influence of Locke and Rousseau, that further helped to bring more and more colonials to the patriot. After the British non-response to the Olive Branch petition, the next step, of course, is going to be independence. And, as we get it, the task was given to a committee, and of course Thomas Jefferson was part of that committee. And there was some debate and amendment, but ultimately we are going to see, more and more support for independence. And there's really a few reasons as well. First of all, we're going to look at the idea of the fact that the British are not responding to anything else. They're not answering the Olive Branch petition. Okay. Secondly, in this time of the revolt and after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British government begins to hire mercenaries, the Hessian mercenaries, known for their brutality. Many colonists were kind of shocked at this. They felt this was sort of a family conflict, and bringing in these outsiders just known for brutality further inflamed them. The British also burned several towns, including Norfolk, which further led to support for independence as well. And even Jefferson had blamed England for continuing the slave trade, despite colonial wishes. And this was dismissed. This didn't quite do it, even though Jefferson himself was a slaveholder. And keep in mind, it's going to see the debates later on, foreshadow the debates with Southerners regarding slavery. The Declaration itself had three major parts: the preamble, most influenced by John Locke; the rights of colonists to break away if natural rights were not violated, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property, stated that all men were created equal. The grievances, seen by the Congress as the most important part, stated 27, including taxation without representation, eliminating the trial of jury, remember those vice admiralty courts, maintaining standing armies in Peacetown, hiring of the mercenaries, and inciting American Indian violence. And the formal declaration officially broke ties, and the United States officially an independent country. One of the big results of the Declaration of, one other major factor that I had not yet mentioned were the ideas of Thomas Paine and common sense. Common sense was published in early 1776 and became really kind of an instant hit in the colonies, very effective propaganda. The main ideas of it included Britain's colonial policies were inconsistent. Independence was really the only course, and nowhere in the physical universe did a smaller heavenly body control a larger one. Why should tiny England control huge North America? The king was called a royal brute of Great Britain, and America had a moral obligation to the world to set up an independent democratic republic untainted by association with the corrupt monarchies of Europe. And this, combined with all the previously mentioned factors, persuaded Congress to go all the way for independence. One other reason that the Congress had to debate independence, and one major result, was after independence, Congress could now ask for foreign aid. And in fact, by 1777, we're going to see the French, after the Battle of Saratoga, get interested in the war. The French weren't really interested in helping the colonies without independence. They didn't want to help them out for the colonists in Britain to make up as well. We're going to see also, as the mobilization begins, we see some supporters for mobilization and some that were not very supportive. John Adams at one point claimed that 1/3 of the colonists were patriots, about 1/3 were loyalists, and about another 1/3 were neutral. The numbers probably exaggerated, some are very difficult to verify, but for the most part, about 20% of the Americans were loyalists or Tories. They were supported by they were supportive of the king. They were generally older, they were more conservative, they were generally educated, they were very fearful of mobocracy as well. Um, they wanted to remain part of the empire as well. Anglican clergy. They were also most numerous in really New York, New Jersey, those middle colonies as well. The Patriots, of course, were the main supporters, and they were the rebels who fought both British soldiers and loyalists. They were most numerous in New England. Like I said, Massachusetts was a hotbed of activity, and they were just more adept at gaining support from the colonials. They helped, the financier Robert Morris helped Congress finance the war. And ultimately, the Patriots, of course, as the war went on, had more influence. About 80,000 loyalists fled the colonies. They were regarded as traitors by the Patriots. Their estates were confiscated and sold, and the funds from those estates actually helped to finance the war. And the war itself, uh, will be fought by really these different militia groups that kind of come together for the colonists. Okay. Going into the war, of course, the British had several advantages. Amongst those advantages were a strong navy, the strongest in the world, uh, greater population. Britain had 7.5 million people. The colonies only 2.5 million. They had, just better, superior money advantage compared with the colonists. Um, and at one point, the British promised the slaves freedom, and about 20,000 slaves in the Carolinas and Georgia joined the British. There were only 5,000 slaves that actually fought for the colonials, for the rebels. And the American Indians also sided with the British. They were reacting really to the land-hungry colonists that were trying to take their land. And so, the British had this. They had a 50,000 man army. They had hired 30,000 Hessians as mercenaries, and they also had about 50,000 loyalists enlists. You know, but keep in mind, the colonists had some advantages as well. First of all, Britain was far. Communication was inefficient, and that helped the colonists. America was too large for really Britain's army to effectively occupy. And the population was too dispersed. It was not as densely populated as England, which made it more difficult for the British. And British generals were poor soldiers. Many British soldiers didn't want to kill Americans. The provisions for the army were poor. And when you look at the war, this defensive war for the colonists, they really only had to tie in order to win. The British had to win and occupy as well. And the colonists also had, better leadership. Ben Franklin as a diplomat, Washington, of course, for the military. The economic aid from France was critical and actually decisive. And, although colonials had very little money, they were agriculturally self-sustaining as well, going into that. Okay. Washington's leadership is something that, could be somewhat debated. Personally, I like Washington, but generally, for the most part, he was seen as someone that was level-headed, conservative in his actions, and was able to, keep his soldiers in shape. He enlisted help from the Prussian Baron von Steuben with military discipline that starving winter at Valley Forge. And the colonists are going to have several notable victories as a result of this. I said earlier the French entered the war after the 1777 Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga, of course, is considered by most to be the turning point of the war and the most important battle. The British were trying to capture New York and sever New England from the rest of the colonies. And Benedict Arnold actually saved New England as well. And after the British surrender, it made possible French aid. The French decided that that would be in their interest to help the colonists, or now the Americans, to win this war. The Spanish and the Netherlands also eventually entered the war, and Saratoga revived the faltering colonial cause. Now, it didn't mean things were easy. Like I said, it was the following winter after Saratoga where Washington's army retired to Valley Forge. Supplies were scarce, food and clothing were scarce, but ultimately we will see Saratoga kind of lead this revival, and especially the help from the French, the Lafayette. And it was the help from the French that's really going to lead to a victory during this for the Americans during this war. Um, you know, Benjamin Franklin had arranged for significant amounts of munitions and military supplies to be shipped to America, which helped forge the alliance. This was before independence even. And then, once the Declaration of Independence and that victory of Saratoga, the alliance was offered. And in 1778, the French recognized American independence, and both sides agreed to wage war until the U.S. won its freedom, or both agreed to terms with Britain. Um, this was hard for a lot of colonists. Think about it. The French had been the enemy. They were Catholic. But the revolution itself, Spain and Holland entered, and we'll see the continued fighting going on. And the final battle, of course, will be the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. The colonists had made their way up through the South. The British Army made their way up through the South, attacking Charleston. However, by the time they got into the Chesapeake region, Washington's army was coming down to meet them. A French fleet blocked the British Navy from helping, and in 1781, General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. And for the most part, this was the last major battle of the war. His entire force. There was still some fighting for about another year until the peace treaty was signed in Paris in 1783. Our next review will be key concepts, will be topics 3.6 through 3.9, and we'll be talking about key concept 3.2, the American Revolution's ideals and the experiments with different forms of government, and particularly the forming of the Republic.